All right, today we're moving on to polynomials. This is a term we're going to talk about for the next month. We've been working with linear equations, and now it's going to change up to a different aspect of algebra. So when we did linear equations, a lot of them were in standard form, a lot of them were in slope-intercept form. That's standard form. Slope-intercept form was y equals mx plus b. Now we're going to deal with polynomials. So a polynomial means many terms. So when you see this prefix poly, that stands for many terms. And we're going to talk about terms a lot. To know what a term is, it's something that's separated by adding and subtracting. So I have this generic example of a term right here. And we're going to say that the A is your coefficient, because you will talk about coefficients in polynomials. And that is the number part of the term, if you have forgotten. Number part of the term. And then we just did a whole lesson on powers and exponents. So this K right here represents your exponent or power. But when we deal with polynomials, sometimes we refer to the exponent and the power as the degree. So you're going to hear me talk about degree today. And then finally, we call this whole thing, this could be called a term. There's no adding and subtracting there, so that's how we know there's just one term. Now, there is something called standard form when you're talking about polynomials. So this is different than a linear equation. So standard form is when you write a polynomial with terms written in descending order. That's the key. Descending order, but you have to know what that descending order is referring to. That's referring to the highest exponent to the lowest exponent. So you're going to have to take a look at your terms and look at where the highest exponent is. That one will have to go first. Now that I just refresh your memory on what a coefficient is, sometimes they will ask you what your leading coefficient is. And the leading coefficient is always the first coefficient of a term when the polynomial is in standard form. Now remember, this standard form is about polynomial standard form, not linear equations. So our first example here says, write each polynomial in standard form, name the leading coefficient. So the first thing I want you guys to look at is ask yourself, how many terms do you see in number 1? I'll give you a second here to think how many terms. There are 4 terms in example 1. 6x minus 7x to the 5th, 4x squared, and 9. So when you put this in standard form, you want the leading coefficient and the highest degree to come first. This 5 is the highest exponent, and the symbol in front of it is negative. So this is going to be negative 7x to the 5th as the first term. Why again? Because 5 is the highest power. And we get rid of that. Then I have 3 terms left. The next highest degree is a 2, and that is positive 4x squared. I have 2 terms left. You always have a degree with a variable. So this 6x comes next because x is really to the power of 1. And then last, you put plus 9. So take a look at that. That is in standard form. And there's one other question it says here. It says name the leading coefficient. The leading coefficient I'm going to put is LC. And remember, a leading coefficient is just the number part of the term, not the whole term. So the leading coefficient for this one is negative 7. because negative 7x to the 5th is your first term, and negative 7 is the leading coefficient. So I'll give you about 30 seconds. Try number 2 right now on your own. Go ahead and put that in standard form. Then tell me the leading coefficient. Okay, so I'm going to start explaining number 2, even if you're not done. First off, you should see that number 2 has 3 terms. And then you're going to look for the highest degree. The highest degree is y to the 6th. That comes first. Second would be y to the 2nd. Right there. And last would be minus 3y. But remember, we're not done, because the question also asks you for the leading coefficient. So I'm going to say leading coefficient. You look over at your first term. The coefficient is really 1, even though we don't see it. And that's how to write a polynomial in standard form. This chart down here is really important. I know I'm not here to explain it the best, but stay with me when going over it. I have 3 columns here. The first column has different polynomials in it. The second column, I want you to put up on top of term, naming by number of term. So let's focus on this column first. If you look down, there are 4 different words there. So the first one says monomial. Monomial stands for 1 term. So if we look over to the left, there's a 3. 3 is 1 term, so we call that a monomial. If we go down to the second row, there's a negative 4x. That is also called a monomial. And the only reason it's called a monomial is because, again, there's only 1 term. 1 term is called a monomial. Then it switches up. On the next line, we see 5x squared minus 7. That's called a binomial because there are 2 terms. So you have to come up with a way to think bi stands for 2, like a bicycle has 2 wheels. A binomial has 2 terms. The third column down has 3 terms. All I'm looking at is the number of terms. That is called a trinomial. 3 terms, like a tricycle. A tricycle has 3 wheels. A trinomial has 3 terms. And there's one last one on this chart. If you look at the bottom, there are 4 terms. But we don't have a prefix for 4. This is called polynomial. So I want you to put a note, if there are 4 or more terms, you're going to just call it a polynomial. Because remember at the beginning of the lesson, poly stood for many. So take a look at that real quick. That column is all about a term. Hopefully that's sinking in. So we have one more column here, and it says degree. So I want you to write above degree, naming by highest degree. So the first thing you have to remember is, what is a degree? A degree is a power. So you're naming this by the highest power. Now if we look over to the left, I'm going to bring it over here because I'm not here to point it out to you. The polynomial is 3, but there is no variable. And if it has no variable, you're going to name it a constant. Yes, that's a term. So if it says name by degree, and you see no variable, it's just a number by itself, you're going to say this is a constant. I'm going to bring over from the left column negative 4x. Well, we did many equations this year. Y equals mx plus b. X really has a power of 1, so those are called linear equations. So when the highest degree is 1, it's called linear. The next one has 5x squared. When you see a 2 as the highest power, that is called a quadratic. It's not, quad usually stands for 4, but to the second degree we call that quadratic. And we are going to work with a lot of quadratic equations over the next couple weeks. So highest degree of 2 is quadratic. If we look at the next polynomial down, the highest degree is 3. Yes, that's one that's easy to remember because the highest degree of 3, that's called cubic. And the highest one you need to know is to the 4th. And when the highest power is 4, that is called quartic. So make sure you know the middle column here is naming it by the number of terms. And when you name by degree, that is naming it by the highest degree. So there's a couple different things going on here. And you have to know when they ask a question, what are they asking you to do? Okay, I'm going to flip this over. Now this is the part where some people get stuck. So if you're in La La Land, make sure you're paying attention now. This says when you name a polynomial by degree, and there is more than one variable. Well, I'm going to go back for a second. We go back to this chart at the bottom. There is only the variable x. All of these only have one variable, the variable x. So we go back to the back. Here's the first example. This example has 3 variables. First, I hope you can understand why this is 3 variables. There's an x, there's a y, and a z. So that has 3 variables, an x, a y, and a z. So this says when there's 3 variables, you have to add the exponents degrees of each term individually and choose the highest. Well, this has 3 variables and there is only one term. There's only one term because there is no adding and subtracting. So what you do is you take a look at the degrees. 3, 2, and this z really has a 1. So we're going to add the degree of 3, degree of 2, and the degree of 1. And that equals 6. So this example right here, we say that this is the 6th degree. And again, the only reason you do that is because there is more than one variable. So we have these examples here, then I'm going to try to show you the difference between naming with degrees. So this says, name the polynomial by term and degree. When I look at number 1, there are 1, 2, 3 terms. I'm going to just put little notes here because I'm not here to emphasize this. There is only one variable. So when I name this by term, it has 3 terms. This is called a trinomial. Trinomial because it has 3 terms. When you name it by degree and it has one variable, you're looking at the highest degree. And the highest degree on this one is a 2. So if you turn your chart over, when the degree is 2, this is called quadratic. Okay?